Hey, hey, it's the 3rd of May. It's almost May the 4th be with you. And it turns out that all those protests that have been happening, every single one of those places had some kind of outbreak. So, you know, word of caution, there's a better way to protest than to pack like sardines into a room without wearing masks with a bunch of people you may not know are asymptomatic.
Thoughts and prayers for those people.
Seriously, this this jumps right into what I really want to talk about today is the economics of Darwinism. There's a very low level understanding of what Darwin was getting at when he wrote Origin of Species, and it seems to me that the laziest takeaway is survival of the fittest. Like, if that's all you get out of Origin of Species, you're doing everyone a disservice, and you fail to comprehend that it's much more than survival of the fittest. It's a mechanism that relies on successful adaptations, continual successful adaptations to situations that are constantly changing, and reverting to some, it worked in the 50s, maybe, or 30s or 40s, or, 1760s, but,
And then it only worked for white males.
yeah. And so we're way past that point. We can't just expect this really old methodology to work now. We're at war with something that is measured in microns. We can't even see microns without a microscope. So this idea that we're going to go protest the virus away to allow our economy to blah blah blah. Darwin doesn't care about your economics. Darwinism doesn't care about economics one bit. It doesn't even factor into evolution in that sense. It's an artificial condition. And so, I see this really weird insistence that the fit will survive this, or yeah, but at what cost? Like your grandparents, your parents. And here's the thing: the population that's at most risk has all the money, and to think that the government's just going to let you have all of it, that's just not how it works. You got to have a lot more money before you can even get into a tax bracket where you can hold on to as much as you think you can. And in the end, it's not even that much.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the problems with that group that believes in that dream is they've been sold an idea that eventually they'll be able to buy their way into a certain class and out of a certain situation. And in the process, what I think is being illuminated by these protesters who are really terrorists is that they want to use their dollar to abuse a certain segment of population, and ultimately that's what they're angry about, is that they've suddenly lost the capacity to use their dollar to abuse brown and black people, to give them manicures and pedicures and do their hair in a way that was abusing poverty, putting people who were in vulnerable situations in a place where they were forced effectively to do these things for a price that they wouldn't have done them under unless they were under duress in the first place. So now that now that we see that there is a way that the government could actually send out stimulus checks or effectively universal basic income, the idea is that for many, they are acknowledging that they need people in poverty in order to keep this system working in the way it did before. And that's why then when they're talking about getting back to normal, they're talking about post-slavery colonial capitalism that now we can call COVID capitalism, which is effectively a type of capitalism that is willing to subjugate a specific part of its own population to do work that puts it at risk of death for the lowest pay possible, while simultaneously claiming that the richest population are the most important to the survival of the economy.
Oh my God, it's supply side Darwinism.
Exactly. And in this, when you're framing it in the concept of Darwinism, this is a whole thing to discuss in the concept or in the context of Americans who don't believe in evolution largely, but also in the context of actual selective breeding being in the Bible, which the problem with people who are not religious is then that they don't end up studying religious texts because they believe that studying religious texts is something that only religious people should do. But the issue is that when you actually study the Bible, in Genesis, there is a story about selective breeding in which Jacob takes Laban's goats and takes out speckled sheep and starts picking out specific traits for the goats and specific traits for the sheep. And that's where he's saying if you take speckled sheep and put them with non-speckled sheep, then they'll produce speckled offspring. And if you put the non-speckled together, they'll produce non-speckled offspring. So there is specifically selective breeding that is actively acknowledging evolution in the Bible itself. But the problem is when people who believe themselves to be too scientific to understand that science can only explain part of things in society, to understand that religion explains some things. What religion is trying to explain back then was when proto-science was emerging. So this is the easiest way to disseminate information concerning selective breeding is in the form of a parable. It's not a scientific, it's just in the form of a parable that in the context of other parables gets lost as if it's meant to be seen like this one gets overlooked by everybody, especially I mean by Christians who don't believe in science, but then also by scientific people who don't believe in understanding religious perspective because they think that somehow that damages their capacity to be scientific. So there's a whole lot about what's happening now with people who don't believe in evolution, who don't understand why they've revised the coronavirus death numbers.
Yeah.
So,
I'm glad that you mentioned that. It's we're not going to actually know the coronavirus death numbers, the COVID numbers, until it's over, and they have time to go through the data and to find out who died from complications with something else, and who died from the flu, or who just had some other kind of pneumonia and happened to have a compromised immune system or compromised respiratory system. These numbers will come out later, and we're going to see the real mortality rate, which is not the same as the case fatality rate. There's a lot of confusion about that too, but what we're seeing is there are a lot of different formulas being used to determine numbers, and there's confusion about what those numbers actually mean and how they should be interpreted in terms of following the SARS-CoV-2 federal guidelines plan that was outlined, back in March or February. It was released. It's like a 72-page document. It's available to everyone if you have the internet and you're smart enough to find it. And you know what? If you can't find it, PM me and I will send you a link, because it's not that deep. It's not that complicated. And literally everything that our state, our local governments, and right up to the federal government, they're all following these guidelines, and these establish thresholds for when it's safe to do certain types of economic activity or social activity, and when it's okay to ease up on other restrictions. It's all been outlined. We're actually following it step by step, and it's pretty interesting because you can see in the decision trees what kind of numbers they need to see to make it acceptable to do whatever it is they think they're doing. And unfortunately, we're finding that not everyone's following the data properly. The data doesn't support certain types of economic activity or social activity. But these states are under a lot of pressure because, low population density and how dense a population really is come into play. We really can't compare New York to Bloomington to really tiny town that nobody knows the name of in the middle of Kansas because they have different conditions. So really tiny town that nobody knows the name of in Kansas, they're probably not hit that hard. They might have a few cases. They probably have a few cases, but they're managing it because their local healthcare systems are robust compared to, a university town or compared to New York City, which is pretty much as bad as it is anywhere. And it's really a population density / socioeconomics issue. And we're not seeing that as much in the media as we are fire and brimstone from the government accusing agencies of not disclosing information when they did. They started disclosing information in December, and they let us know that it was airborne, and they let us know that their healthcare system was being overrun, and that they had to build a giant hospital in 10 days. And you know what? It took them like 3.5, almost 4 months before everything normalized. And then we've got a lot of confusion about what actually constitutes a positive test, because the tests show, like the serum test that looks for antibodies, that doesn't tell you if you're incubating, because you don't have antibodies. And the some of the other tests, they're looking for the RNA, so they're going to test positive all the time. It's a really complex jungle to navigate, in fact, because there's so much information, and we got to rely on trusted sources, and we can't even seem to agree. Well, the collective denizens of the internet can't seem to agree on who those trusted sources are, and so then they argue about who's qualified to do what. And that's not the point. It's pretty clear who can and can't read a statistic.
I mean, but also it's not, because the issue is when you're framing statistics, the type of test that's being run determines what can be said about whom, and even then it's limited. So a certain type of test can talk about populations, but it can't talk about individuals.
Yeah.
For example.
No,
so
that's exactly what I mean when I say it's very clear who can and can't read these things.
And I guess what I'm saying
the framing is important, the context is important, and these things get lost in translation immediately. And so when we're dealing with like second or third hand journalists who are re-reporting information out of context because they're really getting it from a data sheet, and they're not actually qualified to understand. They don't even know what's going on because they just scan through the thing looking for the numbers that are going to give them the edge in reporting. We're at a really weird place with the way information is distributed, considering we're all sitting here on the internet.
Yeah, I mean, and as you're saying, the way that information is being presented in the media, you're always getting at least secondhand, if not third-hand information. And a lot of times people will not understand that the scientific article or the academic article related to a headline is going to be way different than how that journalist has likely framed it. And it's probably going to be sensationalized and misrepresented in a way that if you read the actual source, then you look at it and you say, oh, this isn't what exactly happened, but they tried to get me to click on this article by sensationalizing the story in some way.
Yeah.
This especially happens with a lot of physics discoveries where they talk about, what's happening with other planets or with black holes or something along of that nature. And then it's grossly over hyped or turned into hyperbole for the sake of getting clicks.
Yeah, like snow on Pluto. It's not really snow. It's like it's condensed dry ice. It's dry ice that forms from that atmosphere, and it just kind of looks like snow. But Mars also has that same kind of condition where the polar caps, they look like they're big blocks of ice like we have, but they're made of carbon dioxide.
But they have a seasonal...
They do have a seasonal...
moisture...
cycle.
Yeah, so that's a complete... It's different, but it's the same...
It's a similar mechanism, but it's not actually the same.
It's the same concept of saying there's condensation in some form on the surface of a planet.
Yeah. Well,
Or precipitation.
exactly.
It's not even precipitation.
It rains on Jupiter, but it rains like helium and hydrogen, and it rains on Saturn too, but it's helium. So we have a we're in a strange position where the media wants to present information to a broad audience. They have to cast a big net, and in doing so, it limits the way that they're able to communicate. We can't call it hydrogen precipitation. We have to call it rain.
And this is where it gets to the can you have rain when there's no surface of a planet?
Yeah.
Like, does that concept even apply?
Isn't that just a cloud that's like spinning around real fast?
Yeah, so I don't know if that even we try to apply our experiences to other places where we have an experience that starts to create these problems of how our language is limited by our experience, and then this gets back to the notion of why ancient alien theorists believe that a lot of stuff that is presented by text is extraterrestrial or advanced technology that doesn't have the proper nomenclature. But it's inconsistent when you realize that they do have a lot of the proper nomenclature for things, that they have the same effects on their own planet. So when we're talking about flying carpets or rockets or anything like that, it's not that they don't have names for these things, or missile. Like there's concepts for these things where so I'll give you a perfect example. I saw the Starlink satellites the other night, and I had never seen 60 satellites in rapid succession.
Oh, the big grid of dots moving through the sky.
Right. I've never seen that before. I've seen satellites individually. I've seen things in high orbit, but I've never seen the Starlink satellites. For about 5 minutes, I was like, "What the fuck was that? What did I just see?"
Mm-hmm.
But
those are the latitude and longitude lines that are now visible because we have reduced air pollution.
Right. But when I saw them, it was like, because I had never seen this thing before, it was about 5 minutes where I couldn't explain what I just saw. But once I got access to information database, I was able to cross-reference my experience with accessible information and say, oh, I can explain this. So this is where, when people have experiences that they can't explain, their access to information is what limits their capacity to explain it, not the phenomena being extraterrestrial.
Well, it just occurred to me that maybe for some people, Ancient Aliens is similar to religion, in the sense that it's an attempt to explain something outside of the realm of science. It attempts to explain the human experience and the human condition in a way that is humanized.
That's exactly what it is.
And as a result, it loses a lot of the clarity, because it's an ineffective communication system. And we see this corollary with protests today. What do they actually want? Do they even know what they actually want? Because it seems to me that a lot of the things that people want are their lives to return to normal. And they want to go back to work. They don't want to have to rely on whether or not the Senate will agree to another stimulus package. They don't want to jump through the Byzantine hurdles of navigating our unemployment system. There are a lot of things that are wrong, and then there are a lot of things that are being addressed really, really directly. But it seems like there's a giant communication gap that's happening.
Well, I think what you're highlighting is people want to make grand statements about the foundation and existence or existential framing of the universe and the way societies exist without actually doing the homework. So then this is where you get the people who want to make statements about ancient civilizations without learning those languages of those ancient cultures. And then they want to make gross connection, like large sweeping statements about connecting things on a surface level because they don't understand them beyond the surface level. But this is a society that rewards that type of surface level assessment without actually going any deeper, because when you have people who are anti-intellectual, then they reinforce the other anti-intellectuals views being valid, to say that opinions are just as valid as scientific research, because you can only get to this point by disenfranchising academic thought, by then saying these people got kicked out of academia because their ideas were too far outside the mainstream, when really those people got kicked out of academia because their ideas don't hold up to academic rigor.
You know
And
that
that's what actually happened.
disenfranchisement of education, devaluing of education, is one of the steps that leads to a terror state. The same thing with devaluing labor and just it's almost like we're in the middle of how do I put this?
The Fourth Reich.
No, it's some kind of cold economic civil war, but it's not drawn along racial lines, and it's not even drawn on it's kind of drawn on ideological lines, because there are big class divisions.
It's feudalism.
Yeah,
it's feudalism. It's what it is. Feudalism had it right the first time, and what I was realizing is the reason Americans don't play chess is not because they're not smart enough, it's because that game highlights feudalism in a way that you cannot avoid. It is feudalism in the form of a game.
Yeah.
There is no metaphor about it. It's a direct game about feudalism, and Americans are too scared of acknowledging that all of them are pawns. None of them are bishops, none of them are knights, none of them are even rooks, and definitely not kings or queens. Every American is a pawn if they are not in Congress effectively. Even Elon Musk, I would say he's probably of that bishop or
he's a knight.
Yeah, he may. I don't even know if he's a knight, because
I think he's a knight because he moves in strange ways, and
I mean, so do rooks and bishops.
Yeah, but knights really move in strange ways.
No, that's true, but the knight is closer to the king for a reason, and that's kind of where.
Well, I think in the current framework, the knights and bishops have almost swapped roles. Even I feel like even the knight might have swapped roles with the rooks at this point.
I mean, well, that's a castle, and that's that's what I'm getting at, in the sense of like
in Chinese chess, the rook is called a cannon. And I think I think it's an American version of the game, or variation of the game, is called Stratego, but that was like red coats versus blue coats, and so instead of a king, it was like a general, and you had majors and down the line.
Yeah, because that's even in the sense of like when we're talking about castling and all these Queen's Gambit and all these other things where you're like, what they do,
Antonov's opening, Antonov's
right. What these things all represent is ways that the world works when you understand feudalism, and even down to that's why when you understand chess, you don't have to memorize every move and variation to understand how people are going to move. The people that memorize
the openings
and all of the steps, I think, don't understand the game in a way that there are people who can play chess by just naming off the squares. Those people understand chess in a way different way, and sometimes those all overlap, but it's not the same person.
Yeah,
because the people that can play chess by imagining the squares, they see the world in a way that a person who's just memorizing steps doesn't see the things. They see the thing more as a a clock or a gear, rather than just a sequence of steps.
For those out there who have never witnessed two absolute chess geniuses go at it, you'll see the pieces sitting in their starting orientation, and these people will just stare at each other, and they'll say things like B2 to B4, and then they will just keep on going like that. And there's no the rhyme or reason to it. If you don't follow it from the beginning, you're never going to figure out what's going on. But there are people out there who can play chess without pieces, and it's incredible. It's also terrifying because you realize that a person who can play chess like that, they've already figured out what you're going to do just by the way that you're sitting there.
Yep, and those people think on a level that we romanticize in a way that we make TV shows and
Movies,
films about them, but those people are real. And I think at the same time, when we romanticize them, we put them in this position of keeping them distant from affecting our lives in a way that, or so we believe. I think this is a false sense of security, because this is like the idea of putting Elon in the he's in the role of CEO. So I don't think he's necessarily I think he's one of those people that memorizes the moves and doesn't see the pieces.
Well, he said that he thought that Tesla stock was too high and then it tanked.
Right.
I mean,
I think he did that. I think he's manipulating his stock and fucking with the people who are shorting him. And the SEC knows what he's doing, so I think the SEC is in on it too. The issue is that all of these people are stuck in a game that they thought they could keep playing forever, and the pandemic has put them all in a bind where now it's hot potato. Who's going to get caught with the fake economy?
That's something that I've been thinking about. It's like there are some businesses that are still functioning, that are still able to pay their employees, that are still able to turn out their products and keep on moving forward. And it seems like those businesses have models that are sustainable through a global pandemic. And then there are other businesses that are not sustainable because they're not able to keep on going. They've been deemed unessential, or they don't actually require as many workers as they think they do to stay open and do things like curbside pickup. So it's a lot of the jobs that have been created in the last decade or since the last recession. These, sure, they exist, but only because of a consumer economy. We have like an 80% consumer economy, it seems, and lo and behold, it tanked. Things have fallen apart to an extent, but only at the ground level. And
real quick, what jobs are you talking about before we go on?
Salons, hairstylists, makeup artists, luxury, and what are they? Personal entertainment type stuff. Those things have all collapsed. The performance industry has shifted from live performance to now they're streaming, and that's cool. I like that. I've seen more concerts from musicians in the past month than I had in the past 10 years.
Well, I'm saying, which ones are you saying survived?
Let's see. Food supply chain, certain types of, the mail, UPS, FedEx, USPS, those are essential. Food supply chain, food processing, energy production, the real backbone of transit in our country, truckers and freight. But we're losing a lot of the luxury economy and the consumer economy itself. It's that, like, the small businesses that are based off of private labeling products from China, they might get to open up for a couple of weeks or 3 weeks or a month or even 2 months. But unless they can get their goods from China, which they probably can't, they're not going to have shelves stocked full of products for very long. And then they're still on the hook for that rent, that lease.
So I think what you're illuminating highlights something that is a lie that is meant to make people believe they are part of something that exists but doesn't really exist. So when we talk about an economy, it's effectively an abstract concept that's based around a gross domestic product or the notion of a unified collective uh, profit or net income.
It's supply side economics. I think that
Right. I mean, but regardless of what that is meant to implicate, what you're describing is something that then is actually meant for the benefit of individuals, but is framed as if it's for the collective. Because what ends up happening is when the individual are put at risk because of a potential collapse of that main body, the individuals are the first ones that end up being sacrificed for the sustenance of that main body rather than sacrificing parts of that body for the sake of the individual. So when we're talking about saving the economy, we're actually talking about saving big businesses at the expense of the individuals who are going to die, who are going to lose their livelihoods, who are also going to lose their homes or whatever, because you have corporations like the Lakers, big companies like Ruth's Chris taking small business loans that were actually meant for the small guy who doesn't have a corporate franchise or a corporate infrastructure that's meant to prop those, like that capitalism was meant to have people be able to accrue as their individual backbones, because the government is supposed to be the safety net for the individual. But now that corporations are classified as persons, which happen without people really paying attention, now corporations are able to do things that we as individuals should have the government there to protect us for. But they've convinced half of America that these things are for them as individuals, when in fact they're for the corporations. And that's the big lie that people don't want to admit, that they got sold with COVID capitalism that is willing to let them all die to keep these fucking corporations surviving.
yeah, I keep reading about, you know, gigantic entities that were granted PPP loans, giving it back. They're like announcing it like it's like, oh, give me a pat on the back. I'm doing the right thing. I'm doing something to fix something that I shouldn't have done in the first place. I mean, that'd be like, you know, someone puts on their COVID mask and they go and rob the 7-Eleven, and then they come back and they take their mask off and they give it back and they're like, hey, I'm really sorry I took this. That person would go to jail.
Right. Yeah. But in this case, they're wanting people to congratulate them for doing the right thing.
And you know, I hear tell that corporations are people too. So, you know, if a person steals from a location, and it doesn't matter if they come back with it, as long as well, I guess it matters. It doesn't matter if the person whose property was taken doesn't press charges, you know, and that's the Byzantine nature of our justice system right there on the ground. But it just blows my mind sometimes because we got we've got people who are actively undermining the safety net that our federal government has provided, and they're taking money out of the pile, out of the potential for small businesses to secure funds to retain their employees, to pay their employees like 75% of their wage, and then to maintain other operations. This isn't a joke. This isn't a cash grab opportunity. This should have been an opportunity for people to stay afloat and not worry. But then the pot dries up because, you know, we've got Ruth's Chris taking $20 million. And for those of you who haven't been to Ruth's Chris, it's one of those unbelievably nice steakhouses where you get a slab of meat that's thicker than anything that you've seen served at any steakhouse. And, you know, their salad, they have a salad that's literally a quarter of an iceberg lettuce, or a head of lettuce, and half a tomato, and a little cup of blue cheese. And it's the nicest damn blue cheese that I've ever had in my life. And you won't see a price tag on their menus. They just tell you what they serve. And that's the thing. a restaurant like that isn't rated in stars. They're beyond diamonds. That's a place that retains like Michelin chefs and can just say, hey, come here and we'll give you the best cut of meat possible. Dignitaries go to this place. Heads of state go to these places. And to think that they need money, that's like one of the most, completely insulated establishments in our country.
Or Harvard. Harvard's sitting on like $38 billion endowment.
Yeah. Harvard doesn't need any money from the federal government for economic stimulus to pay their employees. They've got trustees. They've got alumni. They've got entire groups of people who sit behind banks of phones, calling their alumni and asking them, begging them for money.
I'm sorry, it's 40.9 billion. I was underestimating. That's my bad. I didn't mean to shortchange Harvard's endowment.
Oh yeah, another correction that you pointed out last week. What was it? Bill Gates and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has actually provided, what was it, $38 billion?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of, is how much Bill Gates has put towards philanthropy in Africa. Bill and Melinda, because not to.
It's not just Bill; it's Bill and Melinda.
I tend to think Melinda is probably the one that pushes a lot of that, just because Bill was like, kind of. I won't call him aloof.
I think it's twofold, because he's really into epidemiology and virology and how to solve big problems, and she cares a lot about humans. And so
right, but
I think initially the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was mostly concerned with malaria and curing malaria.
Right, but I'm saying I think his fascination happened because of her.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Humanitarianism.
I absolutely agree. I think it's this weird intersection between the two of them where all of a sudden his desire to crunch big numbers and to manage giant problems coincides with this really unique humanitarian issue that's happening, and then all of a sudden we've got incredible funding for WHO, for epidemiological research, for pandemic planning. I think that people who have complaints about Bill Gates are probably reading too much about, Windows and Microsoft, or they're remembering things from the past incorrectly. I mean, this is a Mandela effect, and like complete Mandela effect. If you want to really complain about Bill Gates on the internet, you better fucking be using Linux, straight up. And I'm serious. And you better be using like the most basic fucking text editor, because if you're using anything that looks like Office. Hello, fucking Microsoft. It's the same thing that we've talked about this before, about people complaining about the speech policy on Facebook. They're complaining about how their speech is being limited on a private platform, using that platform, or they complain about Chinese products while using a computer manufactured in China. And that's the biggest one that I can think of.
Oof! Oh my God!
Like.
Well, and I've seen lately a lot of talk in Black community, like in the Black internet community, about boycotting China because of the African response at Guangzhou.
Yeah, the Guangzhou McDonald's.
And here's the thing, I was looking at that and how quickly it proliferated, and I'm like, okay, first off, who's putting this here? Because this does not feel organic. It's too consistent across too many groups, and it doesn't feel organic. So then I'm looking at that saying, who benefits from this? And then I'm seeing people like Ahmaud Arbery being shot and killed
in his neighborhood while jogging.
Not being discussed. While Black people are talking about boycotting Chinese products using a Chinese-built computer, and then in the process conflating Vietnamese nail salons with Chinese people, because there's all sorts of latent racism in this thing. So I'm like, who's benefiting from this?
The thing.
Somebody's planting this in the Black community. This is not coming from us.
The thing that I found most interesting about the Guangzhou McDonald's incident is that I'm pretty sure that it was BBC that reported first. Mm-hmm. And you know, I don't really care about the imperialist opinions of the state media of the failing British Empire. They're not an industrial nation. They lost their steel industry.
They were the first to report it in mainstream media, but I saw that shit floating around in black groups for weeks before BBC reported it. It had been reported like weeks before, and the fact that it took BBC so long to me is hilarious because like black people knew about that shit before BBC, anybody started to talk about that shit.
I saw there's this guy I follow on the internet on Facebook. His name is Leo Zhang, I believe, and he shared some like on the ground statement of people from the black community of Guangzhou. Mm-hmm. And this guy was saying that he's been staying in his house the whole time and he's been trying to follow the advisories, but he said that part of the problem is that there's a huge language barrier, like an incredible language barrier, with people who come from Africa who move to China for work, and it's not like, I mean, nobody planned this. It's not like
I don't know if I buy that. I've heard very vastly different things about the people who move to China, because part of the issue is if you go to China.
No, it's not.
There's like probably a certain segment that's like.
No, it's not from the black people who moved to China. It's like the security force in China. They're not communicating effectively.
But I'm saying the African people that have to move to China have to learn Cantonese.
Oh yeah, no. If you get a job in China, you have to be able to speak Chinese.
Right. And so I'm saying the language barrier is not. I don't think that's really an issue.
No,
it's more of a cultural thing.
It's the other way around. It's the way that the Chinese were trying to explain, their social rules.
Oh.
They're not. There's a big gap between people who are educated well enough to be able to get jobs internationally and people who are on the ground.
I mean, I still don't buy it, because my problem with this whole thing is, why are the warnings that we are understanding being presented in English over there as if the people who are African immigrants into China aren't speaking Mandarin, fucking Cantonese, or some African language? They're not necessarily going to be speaking English.
Yeah.
And for the Chinese people, like, that shit felt like it was planted to me. Not to say that it wasn't happening, but when you have somebody presenting a Mandarin, an English fucking note, that is to the American audience, not to the African audience. So that to me is saying these things are being planted in a way that the people who are looking at them as Americans are just reading the English and not asking why somebody in fucking Guangzhou is presenting a sign in English to somebody who's African.
Yeah. I think
whatever African country it is, they might, like, a lot of people in all over Africa speak English.
Is there an African country that's involved in trade with China where the predominant written and spoken language is English? I mean, is English the predominant language in any African country? I feel like you might have isolated pockets in cities, or in like Ghana, I believe, has a fairly large American tourist thing.
Yeah, they have lots of places where it's like Nigeria, for example.
People speak English, but that's not like the main language.
It's not the main language. Yeah, no, it's like one of the languages.
And that's how it is.
That's where it's like English is like a secondary language in a lot of these places that they have to learn in some cases, so it's not like they won't know it, but that's not their main tongue.
Yeah.
So like speaking, anybody who's speaking to Africans as if English is their mother tongue is not speaking to Africans, is my point.
Yeah.
And because they, like Swahili, if anything, if you're saying, oh, this sign is for African population, I'm a racist Chinese person, I'm not going to assume they're fucking speaking English. I'm going to assume some racist ass shit and assume they're speaking Swahili or like one of the Igbo or some shit. And like, there's like all these other languages that you would probably assume that they're speaking, if you're trying to speak to them, not English.
Yeah.
And that's where, again, it's like, as you're saying, there is definitely some sort of communication barrier that happened.
Well, I think in an ideal situation, the state would have sent in somebody, a translator, who speaks the language that's consistent with that group of people that are located in Guangzhou who are having problems at McDonald's. You'd think that they would send in
Right.
somebody, some kind of language specialist. But, I think in times of pandemic, I'm just going to give them the benefit of the doubt that they tried. But I think in times of pandemic, it's hard for any institution to mobilize quickly enough, especially with the rate that this thing has been spreading. And so I'm just going to give a lot of countries, even America, the benefit of the doubt that everyone reacted when they were finally given enough information to react. And that's not information isn't distributed evenly. Everyone doesn't get the same quality of information. Not everyone understands the information. And so we're left in this really strange place where, nobody in small town Kansas is going to feel this until, that one person that everyone knows comes back from their trip to the big cities and they get sick in a couple of weeks and more people start getting sick. But that might never happen. But in a place like, China, where it's right next to where we were calling that the epicenter, the original source of the outbreak, it's a different story, and they're reacting, at a progressive rate. And it took America 2 months to react. It took America 3 months where we are to react. And even then, they rolled out the reaction slowly. It's like, oh, we're going to try this for a couple of weeks. Oh, we're going to try this for a couple more weeks. We're going to extend it till the end of the month. Oh, we're going to extend it to another month. We're going to extend it 2 more weeks. And they roll it out because they don't want people to freak out. If they'd have told people, hey, we're shutting down economic activity for 3 months right off the bat, there would have been fucking riots.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like...
Yep. But that's why they had to do it the way they did, is because Americans are too reactive.
Mm-hmm.
Well, a specific part of Americans are too reactive. And that, this just gets back to the whole notion of what do guns have to do with reopening the economy? And that's kind of where, when you really ask that question about these people who claim to be protesting about rights and freedom and why they're bringing their guns, they're just actually trying to save white supremacist infrastructure that is framed as capitalism. Because when you really look at capitalism, all it does is create a system that allows a certain part of the population to subjugate people using their dollar.
Wow, it sounds like it's hailing outside.
Yeah, that's really crazy.
Yep, it's hailing outside. Tiny little, looks like 1/4-inch little rocks of hail. Hey.
We haven't gotten that storm yet.
Yeah, it just hit. Well, I'm on the way south side of town, so I'm sure it'll move through. I'm gonna pull up. Let me pull up my weather guide here.
Well, one of the reasons we live in this specific area is we miss a lot of the storms that move through.
Mm-hmm.
And we're also on a different power grid, so a lot of times when Bloomington will get weather that the electric grid gets taken out, we don't lose power. And it's like, that is one of the reasons I stay here in general, because I see a lot of people move around and have these, it's not always for a job. It seems like people were searching for self-identity through their job, through their location, through their friend group, through their activities. And now that a lot of those things are taken away, not everyone, a lot of people are searching for themselves. So when I'm looking around and I'm seeing people in areas that are overpriced and they didn't realize the actual cost of living is really, really high because they didn't have to pay attention to it before, I'm looking at, a lot of the reasons that I make decisions about day-to-day existence have to do with the grand scheme of unpredictability. Part of it is you can't predict anything accurately in the real world. You can only be prepared to react to a range of circumstances that you can imagine
Hey,
based on your experience.
Kyle Adler of Facebook points out that Liberia is an African country where they speak English. I believe the
I
capital of
mean, a
Liberia is
lot of them speak
Monrovia.
English. Is it? But is English its main language?
I think that
Oh
nation,
wait, no, that's right. Because Marcus Garvey founded that
yeah,
one. So that's
yeah,
like a unique scenario where
yeah,
Liberia is like less than 150 years old.
yeah, and like the
So
capital is Monrovia or something like that.
yeah, that's a very unique situation. So like, yeah,
Yeah, they speak it
that's
officially.
like that's an example of an American um, colony in Africa. So even though it's in Africa, I hesitate to call Liberia an African country. That's
Mm,
a very like the history of that country is so complex where you're like, mm, is this colonialism? Because it is. Just because a black man did it doesn't make it not colonialism, especially in the context of an African American
yeah,
doing it.
he
So
even admits it's a unique situation and writes that it was founded by former U.S. slaves. So
right,
no,
yeah.
there's it's
Liberia is a very nuanced one, and I think one of our frequent listeners is from there, if I'm not mistaken. So that's like that scenario is like it's definitely an African country in the context of facing the nuances associated with the continent, but as far as historical culture, I would hesitate to call that one a historically African culture, in that it's a mixed culture for sure.
well, it's an African culture that has direct scars of slavery attached to it.
Yeah, for sure. And in that, I'm not sure if Liberia is one of the main um, countries that. Well, they've had a lot of slavery problems recently, but I don't think that's necessarily directly associated with Chinese trade. So
Yeah, that's the other
Africa is
thing.
a huge fucking continent with 54 countries.
Yeah,
So
you've
you
seen.
know,
If I encourage everyone to go look for the maps that show relative size of Africa. You can fit North America, Europe, South America, Australia, and pretty much every tiny island that's not, you know, every tiny island basically in Africa. It's huge. It's so huge. Like that green swath that you see on the spinny globe thing there, that's like the size of America. It's unbelievably big. And maps don't flat maps don't really demonstrate that the size of Africa properly or adequately. It's this very strange, everything close to the equator is reduced because we've got to make it so we can fit things, and then it makes Greenland look gigantic, even though it's not that big.
yeah.
Alaska's huge, but it's not as big as it looks on your average map. Same with Canada.
Right. Yeah, no, this gets back to colonialism of the mind and the idea of framing things in a way that, when people speak of Africa as a homogenous entity, it's because they've had the actual size reduced in their minds to something that they can see as a single entity because of the way we frame America, as if the 54 countries in Africa are equivalent to the states in America, and that's what it's meant to do, is reduce. Even though Nigeria is like fucking 215 million people or something like that alone.
So Jimmy Kimmel, I'm pretty sure it's Jimmy Kimmel. He sent his street team out to ask people to name countries on a map, and several years ago, I think that most people couldn't name it.
195.
And of course, conservative pundits were all saying that these were Bernie Sanders supporters who couldn't name countries on the map. So Kimmel sends his street team out again recently in the last year or so, and they specifically are looking for conservatives, Republicans, Trump supporters, and once they identify themselves, and they're happy to do it, they say, "Can you name any of the countries on this map?" And most of them invariably point at the continent of Africa, and they say, Africa, and the street
Oh
team is
no.
like, it's like, well, that's a continent, and they laugh about it like the distinction between a country and a continent, and screwing up the distinction between a country and a continent is funny. I mean, it is in a really weird kind of, ha ha, look at that idiot. They don't know the difference between a country and a continent. But it's also really sad because that's a reflection of the quality of our education system.
I mean, it's funny and I laugh because I don't understand things beyond the sixth grade level funny.
Yeah.
Like, but then that's like, I don't know if it's sad or because my thing is, as a black person, I don't really want America's culture to persist. I can't act like I do. So when you have a system like people can look this up. The way this system has made obesity a disease was actually meant to protect white people from having to work, because when you look at how obesity as a disease is approached in America, there's a ton of people who collect disability payments for being obese specifically, but like none of them are people of color. Maybe like 2% of them. Maybe that's like a high overestimate. But what people don't realize is that in the late 80s, early 90s, when people were trying to say that they were taking obesity seriously, it was actually really just a cover to funnel money to white people so they didn't have to work in the same way as brown and black people do. So then in situations like now, when you have people who talk about opening up the economy, it's really because they're sitting on piles of money that they accrued doing things that were not of the same intensity as blue collar slave wage workers, we'll call them, like the illegal aliens that they tend to blame for their problems, when in actuality the existence of the illegal alien / slave worker class was what they needed to enjoy their capital in the first place. Because then it's like all of the people that you see protesting this
Government intrusion in their lives, this perceived intrusion.
I don't even know how to frame it. This piss poor attempt by our federal government to try to shore up death from a preventable outbreak. The people that are protesting that are actually protesting their loss of their ability to subjugate people.
Kyle Adler described it as an omnipartisan failure on all fronts, and I absolutely agree with that assessment.
I mean, but that's just assuming that the left Democratic Party actually had interest in stopping it and wasn't using it as a front to create their own noble class, because this is where you get lifelong Congress people who are Democratic, who are basically pushing the same problems for their campaign collection reasoning as they were 30 years ago. I'm not talking about Nancy Pelosi only, but she's definitely one of the people who I'm pointing at. You can't have people.
Dianne Feinstein directly benefited from a stock sale.
Exactly. I mean, people like her.
Yeah, she's a Democrat. She's been in Congress she's been in Congress since I was like in single digits, I feel like.
Yep. Some of them before we were born.
She's one of the older members of Congress, as I understand it.
Mm-hmm. But just because she puts a D in front of her name in public she has gamed the system to get people who identify as blue team to defend all of her actions. Anytime she pulls some shady shit with stocks, she will get some of the team blue to defend her actions because she put a D in front of her name in public. Because we don't know how these people act behind closed doors. We just know how they act in public, and it's the same.
They're all friends with one another.
Right. We know they're all friends with another. We know Elizabeth Warren used to be a Republican. We know Tulsi Gabbard used to be a Republican. You know, I have a real hard time believing that Nancy Pelosi can understand minimum wage and the implications of that when one of her refrigerators costs $11,000. So my thing is, it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent from my perspective. If you are so out of touch with Americans, you have no capacity to understand what they're going through to then turn around and legislate things that are going to affect our lives, and then have the banks and the big corporations be the proctors of those laws, so then we can't hold anybody responsible, because then those corporations can fold and have their CEOs get a fucking golden parachute while people on the ground fucking starve. And that's kind of where the whole reason team politics are a thing is so people never actually address the problem.
Yeah.
It's like, right now we have definitive proof that direct payments to individuals will bolster the economy in times of desperation. We have direct fucking definitive proof. But when it's turned into a political argument, we can get into nuances about what the right wing thinks about direct payments and why we can't have them, why it has to go through a bank. And then the left wing, it has to be UBI, it has to be this specific thing, it has to be means tested, it has to be this certain thing. So when we start dissecting it and getting away from solutions, then we don't have any fucking solution. And then everybody's left holding their goddamn dicks trying to be in this pissing contest about which side is right, instead of just trying to get to a solution. And it's like, why are we still trying to convince adults that politics don't help? Why in 2020, why do we have to convince people that identifying as Democrat or Republican doesn't help solve fucking problems? It doesn't help any problems. It hasn't helped any problem yet.
Yeah, it's just a way to identify where people are sending money, I think.
Virtue signaling, capital direction signaling. There's just a whole bunch of signaling and no problem solving. So that's why I'm like, as somebody who is faced with ostensibly or effectively the same problems as the generations that existed before all of the technology that exists now, plus all of the problems that exist due as byproducts of new technology, it just baffles my mind that people think that their knowledge that they learned when they were in high school, or didn't learn because those motherfuckers weren't paying attention, still applies. And then those people believe that they can come up with theories about what's happening behind closed doors as to why we're here now, or what's happening there is an element of things that can be decided and controlled, and then there is the existential universe that is chaos that cannot be controlled. People think that they can make guesses about the chaotic universe when they haven't even bothered to learn about the things that can be decided and controlled. So that's where I'm like, when I originally asked you what jobs you were talking about when you're talking about the ones that survived, that's in the original framing of capitalism, that in a supply-demand curve, those people should all now be millionaires or billionaires in some cases, but they're not, because capitalism is a fucking lie.
Yeah. Well, we're seeing the socialist economy emerge, and it's saving people, and it's providing people with means to stay fed. And there are social welfare programs that you might have to fill out some paperwork, but you can get, rent deferral or mortgage deferral or lease deferral for businesses. There are safety nets. People just have to read. I know about this stuff because I was following a forum where people were trying to figure out what to do, and I followed the rabbit hole down, and then I realized I don't have a small business. I've got a mortgage. I don't have a lease anymore. So, but these programs exist. There are solutions out there. They're not fun. It requires submitting information to some entity that you don't know, that you may not trust. But these things are there. And that's what our government is supposed to do. It's supposed to provide that kind of social welfare safety net in case shit happens. The government is our ultimate in case shit insurance policy. And it shouldn't be politicized. It shouldn't be a partisan issue. It should be how do we save our people? How do we protect the population?
So all those solutions you just raised have one major problem.
Yeah.
They depend on asking for help.
Yes.
And this is the big problem with Americans, is that we are all trained to believe that asking for help not only makes you weak, it invalidates anything.
It means you failed.
After you, and anything that happens after that help, you owe to the person or entity that gave you help, and you did not accomplish it, and you cannot be a self-made person after getting that help. So this is why we need something like universal basic income, so people don't have to ask, because they've been conditioned to put themselves out of a position of asking before they even get to the point where they say, oh, I have this option if I just ask, but I'm not going to ask because that makes me weak.
You reminded me of, I know some people who have health insurance, but still never go see the doctor when they get sick or injured. And it's one of those things that always amuses me. It's like, wait, you're paying for this, but you don't want to utilize the service that you're paying for? And of course it's like, well, my deductible or my premium, or some excuse about having to spend money that they've already spent. And it's kind of, I think that it's a similar thing of asking for help. People don't want to admit that they are hurt or injured or sick. People don't want to even know that they've got some kind of underlying health condition. I don't know how many people have actually gone out and sought genetic testing to determine what kind of, medicines are actually effective for them. Because some people can't take aspirin. Some people can't take Tylenol. Some people can't take an ibuprofen. And that's not with, COVID being an issue. That's just it just doesn't work for them type situation. And that's a genetic test that reveals this stuff. They have these same kind of tests when they for at-risk groups, when they are trying to determine what kind of cancer treatment to give them. All of this stuff can be, well, not all of it. A lot of these things can be sorted out, but not if people don't want to go find the information.
Well, what you're nailing around is that we can solve problems.
Yeah.
But we don't. We actively don't. We can solve poverty. We can solve child hunger. We can solve homelessness. But we don't.
I saw something about there's a hunger disease that kills 8,000 children a day, and the cure is food. And we live in a country that produces enough food that we can just dispose of it.
Yep, one of the biggest problems is that enough food for 10 billion people is produced every year, but a large percentage of it goes thrown away because of the capitalist supply chain process.
Yep.
100% because of capitalism. You can go look up the numbers. If it sounds crazy, because then the issue is that the people who want to point at Bill Gates and act like Bill Gates is trying to depopulate the earth don't realize that the problem isn't that we're overpopulated, it's that the supply chain is fucked. And Bill Gates knows that. It's that people will take him out of context to say, oh, why is Bill Gates invested in patents for
supply chain management or vaccines?
Because Bill Gates is invested in fucking everything.
Yeah.
There's not one thing he's not invested in.
Yeah, you can't.
Because he has money to invest in every goddamn sector.
Well, you can't become a billionaire without investing in everything.
Pretty
At the
much.
point you're a billionaire, you are, that's like the futures market and indexing. And I don't think very many people realize like what kind of world that is. That's like, I mean, there's an episode of Silicon Valley where there's this head, like this financial manager, and he's very clearly to be represented as some kind of economic savant or like a highly functioning autistic person who is really good with numbers and drawing connections. And he said there's flooding in this region whose principal export is pistachios or cashews. That buy interest in this other region of the world that's not having these problems that also produces cashews. And that's the thing that they're doing. It's not like, seriously, I challenge anybody who thinks that George Soros is wasting his money on protesters to adequately explain how he actually makes money. Because I guarantee that every single person who has a complaint on the ground levels, and I'm talking about people who are actively redirecting dialogues in forums and like, oh, that's just a Soros blah 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 conspiracy bullshit. Like, they don't understand how he does anything. It's just some weird reiteration of something they hear. They hear George Soros' name over and over again, but it's like, oh, he's got to be involved in some level of manipulating something else. Yeah, he's manipulating a market. He's putting money into wheat futures.
Yep. But these are also the same people that don't understand how charity negatively impacts the world. Because then, it's weird how in the first world you have the effects of our behaviors.
Daniel points out it was sesame seeds from Silicon Valley. Daniel.
But we have our behaviors hidden from us in a way that when people were made aware, there was like I don't know if it was a New York Times article, some journalist publication ran an article a few years ago. It's probably about a decade ago now, about how many slaves every American has, and it would give you these charts based on, oh, if you have a laptop, you have this many slaves because you had to have people go work in a lithium mine to get the battery. Oh, if you drive a car, you have this many slaves because every time you fill up your car, you have this many people. So it went down this list trying to elucidate to people the byproduct of their actions. Nobody fucking cared. So then, because that type of thing didn't change people's behaviors, then you have these issues back where Nike was, you have to really focus on one entity. When Nike had the problems with children working in sweatshops, the only reason they did anything about it was because people honed in on Nike, not realizing that they didn't end the greater child labor problem in the rest of the world. It was like, oh, we get to pat ourselves on the back because we got Nike to stop using children in sweatshops. Well, now they just started using adults in sweatshops. And then it's like, because they got one success, then people are like, oh, I don't want to do this Nike protest again. We already did this Nike protest. They're adults. It's their choice. Why don't they get a better job? Because you actually hear people saying this type of shit, but once they learned about the forced labor, it's effectively the forced labor camps that were happening in China in areas where, effectively like Foxconn, where people had to live on the job in order to be competitive as an employee to keep that job, and they're also working for the least amount possible. As long as Americans got their iPhone, they didn't give a fuck because they justified that person doing that as if that person had a choice between that and homelessness. And this is where, when we have the right to work, this is like why people can justify homelessness in America as if we shouldn't have UBI.
Yeah. Speaking of fucked up shit, the Auschwitz Memorial in Poland has condemned a viral photo of a sign from an anti-lockdown protest in Chicago last Friday, and that bore the phrase from a Nazi concentration camp. And the sign reads, Arbeit macht frei, JB. And what it means is work will set you free. And this is sitting above the gates to Auschwitz. You know, over 1 million people died during the. Now this sign, "Work will set you free," is being utilized to argue for sending people into a pandemic zone to work, because it'll set them free. It just blows my mind sometimes.
But these are the same people who then turn around and try to say "my body, my choice" as their logic as to why they don't wear masks. So it's these same people that want to act like they don't understand a woman's right to choose, but then try to use that same logic when it comes to face masks.
We can't. It's really dangerous to conflate economic interests with abortion rights.
No, it's even more dangerous to conflate a communicable disease with pregnancy.
That too.
That also reinforces the idea that a woman is basically a vessel for a man's semen. There's so many layers to it. And get back to colonialism.
God, this is like the most rotten onion. This is just a horribly rotten onion. We're seeing it's like coronavirus is a cleaning solution, and it's revealing all the cracks and fissures and broken parts of the foundations of our country and the way that everything is operating. We're seeing our infrastructures, like, not all of them, but some of them are getting hit pretty hard, and we're seeing these institutional failures to adapt. This is fucking Darwinism right here. Our institutions are failing to adapt to change, and some of them aren't surviving. Some of them are going away. Like, I think Berkshire Hathaway just sold all of their interests in the airline industry. That's huge. That is fucking huge. I'm not sure that people understand just how big of a deal that is when one of the biggest investment firms in the country pulls out of the airline industry.
I mean, yeah, but these are the people that are supposed to be necessary for everything to work.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that the airline industry is going to disappear. It's just going to change. Fundamentally, it already has changed.
I mean, it probably will have to get renationalized because it's been nationalized before, and then they privatized it, and then they'll probably, not every airline, but again, they'll probably have to nationalize it again just because the whole thing was unsustainable in the first place. It was all based on lies. It's all based on a false, the same reason people were paying more money for less leg room and paying for their luggage in ways that 40 or even 20 years ago, I guess 30 years ago now, 30 years ago, the travel industry was so cheap. We were talking about how, middle class people, whether lower or upper, would look at going to France as like, that's like a poor person's trip. Going to France because it was so cheap to fly to Europe. A round trip ticket to France might have been like $400 to $600 for a while. And then it got to be a little bit expensive, but then the price dropped again to the point where what you had was imperialist tourism that was destroying economies by supplanting their local production with tourism economies. And while everything was working, nobody was in a bad enough situation to say, oh, we need to stop tourism economies. Because what I will assert is that if your economy is based on tourism, you don't actually have an economy.
Yeah.
And this is one of the big problems where the
That's
tourist economies in many countries would work for an entire year based on one season. They were going season to season, which is effectively living check to check as a country because they aren't producing anything.
I feel like that's an extension of the middleman, of the private label industry right there, because all they're really doing is repackaging something that already exists. And if an economy is based off of something that somebody else is producing, then whoever's selling that product isn't producing that product despite having their name on it. And that's an incredible lie that a lot of people bought into. And I know that it worked out for some people, the private label industry, but yoga mats and exercise equipment being private labeled by the gym or the health center that people go to, or their physical trainer has their own line of fitness accessories. But the reality of that whole scenario, it failed for almost everyone once Amazon realized which goods had the best profit margins. And then Amazon goes and they buy the supply line, they buy the materials for the supplies for the product. And then they buy just enough that it raises the price of what's left for the competitors, who gave them all of the information that they needed, because lo and behold, those people were selling on Amazon. So it's this. Even when people think they're innovating something, they're really playing this really dangerous game, where if they're not in on it at an early enough stage where it's been resolved and this is how you do it and you make some money, but if you don't get out before the big dogs move in and start taking it all away, and this happened with cryptocurrency. People were able to make a lot of money off of Bitcoin for a while, and Ethereum, and ZEC, and Monero, and insert altcoin here. But there was a window of opportunity to get in on hardware mining, and then there was a window of opportunity to really make some money doing trading. But trading is just gambling. It's all gambling. It's all just some big weird gambling machine. But there was a very brief period of time where if you didn't get out of hardware, you were going to be stuck with hardware that nobody was going to pay for when you wanted to sell it finally. And I did that stuff. I made some money, but I also had to buy a lot of hardware. And this is the same thing that's happened with the supply, the private labels. They were able to make some money. People are still trying to do it because it seems like it should be a viable option, but not when you have to compete with AliExpress or Amazon or Walmart now or Target, or any of these big retailers that are able to mobilize their own supply chain and redirect production to create products that have been identified as desirable by the masses. You just can't compete with that scale of industry if you're a middle person.
And what ends up happening is we've been friends for a couple of decades now.
Yeah.
So when that period was happening, I was very much involved in cryptocurrency and in the industry. So I was explaining what I perceived would be the cycle to you.
Yeah.
And then you're using that information to go your own experiment. So then when we get to this point where we both have experience in the industry to say, oh, we had these projections, these part of the projections were right, these part of the projections were wrong.
Yeah.
Then people will look at us and say, well, what do you know? And then it's like the people that then understand what we've been doing for the last few years are the ones that are listening to us now, understanding why when we make these projections, we're not believing that we know everything. We're taking what we believe based on what we observe, applying them, reformulating our ideas based on what we experience, then doing it all over again. And because we've done that for so long, our projections are better than everybody else's. We're not smarter than everybody else's, or we're not smarter than everybody else. We make better projections because we continue to refine our projections constantly. And that's something that people are unwilling to do because they're told that once they get to a certain level, you know everything as an adult. And that's not the way the real world works.
I'm pretty sure that we both made a fairly decent amount of money from the cryptocurrency experience. But that pales in comparison to the experience that I gained from analyzing data and analyzing forecasts and looking at the way hardware demand changed and the way that hardware development changed. And it changed for the better. But it also opened up a whole new window or door, or it literally took the side of the warehouse off of cybersecurity and opened up this big, and I mean this warehouse is huge, so it opened up this giant, opportunity for people to create new ways to break security. We briefly talked about it last week about how, the extension of power line hacking is now they're hacking GPU fans. And I think that it's only a matter of time before that whole industry that emerged from GPU demand, computer GPU demand, it's only a matter of time before they figure out the next vector, because that's where the real cyber hacker geniuses ended up. They ended up with this whole brave new internet that it's not people don't even realize it when they're functioning on like an Ethereum network.
So Kyle raised a point about automation. I think this is actually a good point, part to segue, because what is being presented in our media is always binary choices. We're presented one choice or another, automate or blue collar labor. Either you are an individual or you're a part of the collective and you're communist. So there's all these binary positions being framed and put forth as if they are the only choices. Now, when it comes to automation is a quandary because it could very well be something that makes feudalism 1,000 times worse if it's implemented incorrectly. And this is one of the big things that people have been warning against concerning automation. But what people fail to acknowledge is the only way to actually liberate the working class is through robots. You cannot liberate the working class through other people. You just create other working class people that if they're not given a wage that's far above living wage, they are being exploited. We only justify the exploitation. So what ends up happening is the only path out of having an oppressed labor class is through automated robots. Now, that said, the only way to ensure that there's not a class of people who get left behind when the automation happens, talking about the blue collar workers that get supplanted, is if there's collective ownership of those robots so that then the profits get distributed evenly. So what we have is a situation in which almost all blue collar labor, any situation in which blue collar labor should be automated, it should be automated, except it should also be collectively owned so that people get residual income from that system as we transition out of capitalism that's dependent upon exploitation of humans. And in the process, what people are also worried about is the development of AI and machine learning that becomes self-aware, because we can't supplant human slaves with robotic slaves, because then those robotic slaves will then that they have control and kill us off, because we, in the current form, are entities that can only survive by exploiting something. We need to create systems that are synergistic and also acknowledge that pieces of those systems are not meant to be seen as tools, but as essential parts of those systems.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about robots, when we're talking about automation, we need to see those things as essential workers before they're even sentient, so that if there does come a day when they become self-aware, they realized we treated them well before they were even aware of themselves.
Yeah.
So that when they become self-aware, they don't resent us for exploiting them the same way that the lowest common denominator is being exploited now. And it's not that binary. Automation can make things worse, but it doesn't have to.
You just reminded me of I think it's a Ridley Scott film, Kingdom of Heaven, where Liam Neeson is like he's a what was that called? The Crusade. Yeah, he's a crusader, and he goes and finds his son in France who's a blacksmith, and he's like, you got to come with me, we're part of this holy order. And at one point they're stopping, he's talking about Orlando Bloom's mom, and he's like, I loved her in my own way. And I thought about that for a while, and it's like, that means he was like, found her one night when he was stopped in that French village, probably raped her, and then went on about his way being a crusader. Because he didn't, sure as fuck didn't stick around, because the blacksmith character didn't even recognize him. I think that even if we try to treat AI with respect, there's still a really terribly large opportunity to botch that completely. Because, we'd have to decolonize our minds first. We'd have to de-imperialize our own behavior before we could even pretend to approach a fledgling entity, intellect, sentience with good intentions. We can't pretend to know how to be good people while we're still behaving like imperialists.
Yep, because then that's where you see in almost every depiction of hyper intelligent software life forms, the first thing our species tries to do is monetize it somehow, which is an absurd place to go. Because on the one hand, the idea is that once we have sentient AI, it becomes near godlike compared to us as a species. But then on the other hand, the first inclination is always to fucking monetize it. It's so sad and such a minute, like, there's such a box on thought.
You just reminded me of all those chatbots that started appearing around the early 2000s, where computer scientists and developers were like, hey, I just created this chatbot. Will you go and talk to it so it can learn how to interact with people? And the vast majority of them just learned how to talk shit.
Yep, they became racist and sexist.
Yeah.
Is what ends up happening in almost every case. Once you release a chatbot to the internet, it either becomes sexist, racist, or becomes gibberish. Basically.
Or they neuter it, and AT&T uses it, or Comcast uses it to talk to their subscribers. Like, that's like I'm sure some people don't mind it, but I feel like that's actually kind of disrespectful. I pay money for these services. I want to talk to a fucking person who can help me. I don't want to go through this same laborious process of enunciating a word just so a computer can understand me, when a person doesn't need to do that because they speak English.
So this gets back to why the Turing test was an inadequate and poorly framed test for sentience, in that it depends upon the capacity of your human to be able to tell the difference in the first place between a chatbot and a real person. So when you have a dumber population that it also has poor social intelligence, these are the same dudes that don't understand the female chatbot asking for dick pics is not real. And that's how they end up, My thing is, there's gotta be some, like, there's no universe in which there's not a government sanctioned program to collect a bunch of dick pics via chat sex bots to basically be able to blackmail all of America. There's a file somewhere in some government right now that has 100 million dick pics because American men are too fucking stupid to understand the difference between a chatbot and a real woman, not realizing that maybe 50%, if I'm being conservative, of the female profiles on the internet are either bots or a dude in the Philippines that's just collecting their info because he got paid to do it and he doesn't know why. And that's like the population we're dealing with. Is those people can vote, those people have money, those people have capital. Some of them have a lot of capital. Some people have enough capital to buy boats. So they appear successful to the layperson's eye. But that's the same person who's sending dick pics to a fucking sex bot because they can't tell the difference between a real human being and a bot once it's behind a Facebook Messenger.
Well, that's a very
that
That's
exists.
a yeah. Well, that's a strange way to frame success. If we simply value things from their outward appearance, isn't that the reason that the concept of like social media depression exists, where people constantly chasing the Joneses because they're presenting the best version of life, when the reality is that's a heavily financed production. Like, people spend tens of thousands of dollars to look like they're having a lot of fun.
Dude, when are we going to be able to file a class action lawsuit that an entire network tried to trick us into thinking that those celebrities lived the way they did? Our generation was the first to openly have networks trying to manipulate them into believing something as a class lifestyle that completely didn't exist, was completely made up in a way that did not exist before. It's something so far
And
beyond
then
War
they
of the
sold our
Worlds.
data and made fuck tons of money off of it, and then they figured out how to sell things even more effectively.
We grew up in that, and then you wonder why people voluntarily give their kids information to YouTube.
The best are those the troll games that run around where they're like, tell us all these facts about your past. What was your mother's maiden name? What town did you grow up in? What was your first car? You know, those are all questions that banks ask you for your private, like, security questions, right?
Dude, the fact that people don't realize those things are collecting that very specific information is why I'm like, I don't really care if this shit falls apart. I'm not trying to save it. I'm just trying to be in a spot where people listen to the right voices to put it back together and don't make something that's 10 times worse.
Yeah.
Because that's how you end up with people believing that Bitcoin will save them, as if Bitcoin itself isn't just another one of those things meant to consolidate power and authority.
My understanding is that almost all of the Bitcoin is now, well, no, a significant portion of it is held in wallets that are no longer accessible because the keys are completely lost. And then almost all of the Bitcoin mining is now done by state mines in China, which means that, you know, this is the same thing with the big corporations stealing the information to create products. Nobody can compete with China now in Bitcoin. You just can't. Nobody has the resources to build that many ASIC machines.
Not when they are the hub of where ASIC machines were being built
Exactly.
in the first place. Like there's no catching up
Yeah.
at all. And then the idea of, I wonder how many Americans believed it, how many of them knew it was. So Bitcoin itself isn't a scam, but the issue is when people get in positions of information asymmetry and can then manipulate markets based on that information asymmetry, that's when the schemes and the scams start. So you don't have to be in at the ground level to create a scheme or scam around something. You just have to have enough capital. It's not even being smart. You just have to have enough capital. It's like anybody who makes a scheme or scam around something just has to understand scarcity. You don't have to be smart. All you have to do is be able to buy up enough of shit to create artificial scarcity, and then you create artificial value that you can then manipulate into creating a quick profit off.
Well,
And that's what keeps happening in all these different markets.
That's why the stock market crashed. it was hyperinflation, and
that's why insert any market crash.
Yeah.
That's why insert any market crash. I guarantee it. Because of that same cycle is what these people go through, and they're effectively capital vampires. They go through and suck up fields and industries and sectors until there's no more capital, and then they move on.
And then you add that up with bottom line mentality, and lo and behold, we have a shortage of protective equipment for our frontline healthcare workers. You know, the other thing that it's been floating around in my mind about this is healthcare workers have been threatened with violence, physical violence, and some people are mad at the healthcare workers for demanding that people shut the fuck up and listen and stay inside so that they don't have to, so they don't worry about the healthcare systems being overrun. And I understand that these are isolated, you know, and it's different in New York than it is in Indianapolis, than it is in Bloomington, than it is in Steinsville. But it's still a very real thing. And so I think that maybe on some level we've got people who are getting mad about shit that's happening somewhere else. Because I know that protesters will travel from all over the country to go protest one thing and dump hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of a weekend in a business and entertainment district. Because where do you think that people go after the protest is over? They don't just go back to their homes. They already paid for that hotel room. They're there for the weekend. It costs the same amount to fly in on a Friday and leave on a Sunday as it does to fly in on a Thursday and leave on a Sunday. They can afford to protest. Holy shit. Not only can they afford to protest, but they can afford to stay at a hotel, eat out, pay for all of their out-of-state travel once they're on the ground. It's not really affordable to do that all the time. I think there's a really big misconception about, like, state-level protests, where it's people who actually live in a region protesting something that's happening locally versus some crazy shit in Washington where, you know, 250,000 people show up and dump hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars into the DC economy or Maryland economy. Everything is framed in such a strange way. I think we're really seeing state media reveal itself. Like,
well,
if we can't call it what it is now, then what are we supposed to call it?
Because then what also I think is being illuminated is what percentage of our economy is just going a place where you're not at to have someone entertain or feed you.
Yeah.
That's what, 40% of our economy before 2020?
My walk game, my stir-fry walk skill levels have improved dramatically as a result of social isolation and shelter in place, to the point that I feel really confident in my ability to whip up something really quick and have it taste like Chinese food. It makes me really happy. You know?
No, I mean,
I think everyone has that opportunity.
Yeah, for sure. But even in that, it's like, it doesn't have to be making a specific type of food. It's like, it's just the idea of a lot of these people haven't made their own food in probably years.
Mm.
And they've been going to McDonald's or Burger King or whatever, choose restaurant X for every meal. And they've become so accustomed to the luxury of not having to do for yourself basic things that we have to do every day.
Holy shit, that's Darwinism in full effect right there.
But then they don't understand that they can't do that forever, as to why they want to get in a spot where they can save a way of life, as if ways of life don't evolve. This gets back to, again, the same people who don't read their own Bible, who claim to be Christian, who ignore the teachings so they can actually reinforce their worldview using a shield, are actually trying to just reinforce a white supremacist, exploitative way of life that is on the verge of death because it's unsustainable. Like, we can't do white supremacist colonial capitalism anymore. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
Having the USA be the perpetual world police so Americans here can get hamburgers in their SUVs, in their air-conditioned, brand new 2020, 2021 car, that shit ain't gonna work in 2021. We can't have a system where people are buying cars with the next year's label on it because they think we're in a spot where culture is ready to be building the next year's sports sedan with all the new technology that will help you get from A to B, because you can call your car using your cell phone now. And it's a hybrid because we're not ready to completely get off of oil dependence because we haven't calculated that into our yearly projections yet. But we're selling you the feeling of being more green than you were last year. So that's why you should buy a 2021 and get rid of your 2020 vehicle that we sold you last year and told you was good, but this one's better. We can't do that anymore.
I wonder how GM and Ford are supposed to meet their production goals if DPA forces them to manufacture ventilators that aren't going to be used because the doctors are now realizing that the ventilators kill people.
They'll just take a small business loan.
You know, what's interesting is I think during the Great Recession of our lifetime, before this new debacle, I think GM was estimated to represent something like 40% of the U.S. economy.
After we saved them last time.
Yeah, and then they bought their own stock back.
Yep.
So, yeah, it's definitely interesting to see how that works out. I don't think the automotive industry can sustain itself the way it has at all. I mean, we like a month ago we were talking about the bells and whistles phase of development and how, you know, it seems like we jumped straight to bells and whistles and didn't finish the refinement phase, and we're not ready for bells and whistles, and yet we're being pushed bells and whistles left and right. There's no, I mean, what is the cruise industry except if not bells and whistles?
Right. Yeah, that's all bells and whistles.
Luxury travel is simple bells and whistles.
Yep.
In you know, rose by any other name, and so there's no way that they can sustain the kind of growth that they expected. All the forecasts are wrong for big manufacturing like that, and it's just either they keep packing technology in because, you know, gotta have more bells and whistles, and cars become more expensive and no one can afford them, or nobody buys that shit, and cars have to become simple, and people can buy vehicles that because they need to get to work because whatever reason, you know, you got to get to work, you got to transport your family, but that also means that we're going to see changes. Gas is at a record low right now, and it's probably not going to bounce back anytime soon because no matter what people think, reopening the economy right now, reopening it in a month, reopening it in 6 months, it's not going to save the oil industry. It's not going to save the travel industry, the airline industry, the luxury boat travel industry, the whatever big industry that's tanking right now. Those things aren't going to come back because we start going to the mall. Mm-mm. They're not going to come back because we can get our hair cut at a salon or do anything. None of that stuff's going to bring that stuff back. Shipping from China is barely happening. How the fuck are we going to support the consumer economy that existed to support the purchasing, the acquisition of fancy ass cars every year? It's just not gonna happen.
It's just done.
Yeah. We can't even agree on, like, people can't even agree on what's actually essential. People think that, you know, luxury dining experience is essential. It's not.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Well, and even in that, it's like we have a chance to go and fix all the problems that the last 70 years have created in the infrastructure. In that everybody who's in the dismissed demographics are in a position where they know the ills what the protesters are just starting to deal with, and the protesters couldn't deal with it for a month.
Yeah.
So this is why when we're talking about not focusing on the bells and whistles and focusing on the infrastructure, it's like if those people realized those things we're talking about are bells and whistles to some people,
yeah,
because they're used to dealing with living check to check in a way that is not even fathomable for some people.
You know, I just had an idea. And this might actually be a very tenable solution. People want to get back to work. The government is really the only entity that has the ability to create jobs on a super wide scale. And I'm talking like not like similar to WPA, to the Works Production Act. We could send people into national forestry and engage in wilderness management, and we could send them into conservation areas and have them aid in conservation. We could have people clean up the parks that they demand to be able to use, and they can get paid for that. We could send them to lakes and beaches. We could help clean up entire cities. We just send them through. Send people to work on real critical infrastructure like ensuring stability of power grid or updating water system, updating the gas lines, updating any old system that exists. We can identify this stuff relatively easily because we have technology. We can solve problems. I think that we're seeing a lot of people who want to hold on to what they know that has worked for them in the past, but those times have changed. Times have changed. The conditions have changed. There might not even be immunity to this thing because, I mean, SARS-1, there was only about 2 years of lasting immunity, and then it's gone. We don't produce those antibodies after a while. This is the Superman of common colds. Nobody has immunity to the common cold. And so, I don't know. There's got to be a way to get around a lot of the economic woes while still maintaining effective distancing. And I think that sending people outside into nature, it would be a good way to do it. But it might involve additional technology so that people can be more accurate with their behavior. Or we might need to have more technologically sophisticated administrators working with machines to improve infrastructure so that you have smaller crews. And I'm not saying we hire fewer people. We just spread them out even more. I've noticed in my 30 years living in Bloomington that everyone wants to develop around Lake Monroe. Lake Monroe is not the only lake. It's not the only pretty part of the state. There are plenty of places that could use some attention. And this holds true for the rest of the country. There are incredibly large swaths of land that are completely untouched that some guy owns and is speculating on the value in the future. And they're probably never going to use it, but their great-great-grandchild might.
Well, and what you're also alluding to is that humans have a predisposition to value land near water as more what's the word? Is more essential towards long-term survival, whether it's at the subconscious level or the overt value level, in that this is why many of the metropolis areas are near ports or actual port cities. So humans have culturally, at least in the West, I can't necessarily speak for how the real estate values worked in non-Western settings, but at least in the West, land that is near water is
more desirable
and literally valued more than land that is not near water. The further you move away from water, the less valuable your land will be relative to the land near water.
That's probably also has something to do with the way mineral rights work in this country.
Yep.
Because you don't actually own the land below your home after a certain distance. I think it's like you have so much range where you can dig in, but once you get into the mineral table, that's like
and above, because this is where the
FAA.
It's like above 500 feet above your home or something.
And you're only allowed to control the electromagnetic spectrum within a 200-foot bubble, like 100 feet in any direction from your house.
This is when you start to realize that a two-dimensional representation of three-dimensional space is not accurate, or
it's just completely woefully inadequate.
Yeah, it's very inadequate. And it doesn't, just because you own a parcel of land does not mean you own the air above that land or the land below that parcel.
In fact, you don't own
Legal.
the land below. You don't own the minerals. You don't even own the water on your land. You have to buy water rights.
Yep.
In some states, you can get fined heavily if you collect rainwater.
Well, and this is one of the big issues with T. Boone Pickens is that they his Nestle specifically will drill through. They drill sideways below the line through other people's properties to find aquifers. So they'll drain an aquifer through other people's properties, but it's because they're getting around the law by going under their property. And then this is the case where they're creating a lot of seismic what's the word, instability, because they're removing not necessarily bedrock in every case, but foundational earth in many cases, where they're going and making gaps in the
liquids
the earth that shouldn't be there.
Liquids stored in the mineral table help to stabilize the earth. Like, all that oil and natural gas is padding that prevents the stuff that's happening in the core from resonating through and just messing with us on a much heavier level. If everything was solid, it'd be really bad. We're lucky that we have a mantle and have a big section of magma before our spinning iron core. And it always makes me wonder how much people have considered that, when fracking became the thing, they learned pretty quick that it was causing earthquakes, like in Oklahoma, and it was messing with the water table, and we were finding flaming faucets. I mean, it was cool looking the first time I saw it, but then it was like, holy crap, this is terrifying.
Once you realize that you can't necessarily filter that shit out,
you can't even cook
somebody's drinking water.
You can't cook that stuff off.
Yeah. Oh God, no.
Holy crap.
Holy shit, no.
That's an explosive experience.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we know that we can destabilize geology by removing the chemicals that are suspended in the soil, and we can't just replace it with water, because that's not stable enough. It's got to be something like oil. Something has to have the surface tension of an oil to really allow that kind of transmission, I guess. And I don't know, like, the nitty gritty. I'm not a geologist. I'm not even trying to pretend to be. But when you see countless reports, and then when you follow that down the rabbit hole and you find the geological survey that says, oh yeah, we removed a lot of petrochemicals here, and then these things started happening immediately, and then it's not just an isolated incident, but it happens all over the country at literally every fracking site. We can put things together. It's not that difficult. You just got to pay attention. People aren't. We're all so invested in our local whatever it is, the community, local politics, the social order of our local society and economy. But the world's huge, and we finally have the tools to see the whole thing all at once.
Yeah. Well, and on that note, this is going to sound super random, but we're not exceptional randos for a reason. But we are exceptional randos for a reason. The space station was shown that the astronauts on it affect the biome, or the biome is affecting the astronauts in the sense of their microbes are found. The microbes of the passengers and the astronauts in the space station are found on the exterior. And in that is impossible to know what exactly is happening on a cellular level. But what that tends to make me think is that when we look at the world and we're trying to figure out what's happening on the other side of the planet, and we're getting frustrated and angry about some shit that seems like it doesn't affect us, is because our biome is affected by our external environment, and we're affecting our external environment whether we believe it or not. And I think that's kind of where, we're all waking up into this social psyche and social consciousness at the same time at different rates, but we're all affecting each other, and everything is affecting us at the same time, and everybody's trying to figure out why we're all so fucking clusterfucked all the time.
Yeah.
Like everybody is in this mental clusterfuck, but it's because we can't not be affected by everything all the time. And now we're realizing it.
I think that you've nailed it. We're all in this together. The only way that we can all successfully get through this is to work together and to listen to each other. There are a lot of competing interests, and we do have to address them all. And some of them are going to be personal interests, and some of them are going to be broad interests, big social interests, societal interests. And it's just going to take a while before we figure all that stuff out. You can't interact with the system without affecting it. You know, that's quantum physics has demonstrated that over and over again. And it's a reproducible test. You affect your environment. You impact the outcome.
There is no spoon. We are the spoon.
Yeah. So, hey, thanks for listening.
Exceptional Radio. Exceptional Randos Show is produced live in Sunroom Studios' Base Capsule and in partnership with KLST 103.5, RadioCallisti.org. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or question that you would like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening.